There are bars, walls, watchtowers. There are alarms, shackles, and locked doors designed to contain the worst humanity has to offer. But sometimes, none of it is enough. Sometimes, the monsters get out. And when they do, they don't run to start over. They run to kill again. This isn't a list of daring prison breaks. It's a chronicle of vengeance, relapse, and urges that never died. Men who murdered were caught, caged, and then for one moment were free. And in that moment, death followed. These are 15 killers who escaped prison, then killed again. Ted Bundy. Escape into darkness.
Before his escape, Ted Bundy had been out of his cell exploring that overhead crawl space he escaped through. Jail officials knew about that, and they did nothing about it.
He was charming, smart, polite, the kind of man who could talk his way out of anything, and that's exactly what he did, twice. Ted Bundy wasn't just a killer. He was a master manipulator, a shapeshifter with a smile. But behind the charisma was a bloodlust. Bundy was arrested in 1975 after a string of brutal murders. Women, young, brunette, college-aged, vanished across states. The pattern was horrifying, the details grotesque, and yet Bundy sat in court like a law student because he was one. He defended himself, flirted with reporters, wore the mask of civility while bodies piled up behind him. In 1977, he escaped. First, from a courthouse library. He jumped from a second-story window and vanished into the woods, captured 6 days later. But that wasn't the end. That same year, he starved himself in jail, lost enough weight to wriggle through a hole in the ceiling of his cell, crawled through ducts, walked out the front door. No one noticed for 15 hours. He headed south, to Florida, to hell. Weeks later, in the early hours of January 15, 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. What followed was slaughter. 2 young women bludgeoned to death, 2 others savagely beaten. Hours later, another victim, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, abducted and murdered. All after his escape, all preventable. When Bundy was finally recaptured, he was sentenced to death. He died in the electric chair in 1989, but those final murders, they weren't spontaneous. They were a plan, a hunger that needed an opening. And decades later, inside the cold, concrete cells of a New York prison, another killer waited for that same opportunity. His name was Richard Matt, and unlike Bundy, he didn't run alone. He had a partner, and a map, and a list of people he still wanted to hurt. Richard Matt and David Sweat, the deadly duo. It started with small favors, friendly smiles, a flirtation that turned into manipulation. By the time prison worker Joyce Mitchell realized what she'd done, it was too late. She had already smuggled hacksaw blades inside frozen hamburger meat. Not for one inmate, but for 2. Richard Matt was a seasoned predator, violent, charismatic, a man who once kidnapped and dismembered his boss, then dissolved the body in acid. David Sweat was colder, convicted for executing a sheriff's deputy and then dragging the body across a parking lot. Neither man had remorse. Both had time, and together they had a plan. Clinton Correctional Facility in upstate New York was built like a fortress, but in June 2015, that fortress was breached from the inside. Matt and Sweat cut through the steel backs of their cells, crawled into a labyrinth of tunnels and catwalks, navigated a century-old steam pipe system, and emerged into the night through a manhole cover, leaving behind a taunting note, "Have a nice day." What followed wasn't a manhunt. It was a siege. 23 days, hundreds of officers, armored vehicles, dogs, drones, thermal imaging, entire towns locked down, roads closed, the countryside flooded with fear, because these weren't fugitives looking for freedom. They were killers with unfinished business. Their goal wasn't escape. It was vengeance. Matt had a list. And at the top of that list, the husband of the woman who helped them. He was marked for death. Executing him was supposed to be the first act of freedom. Only a delay in the getaway car stopped the plan. For weeks they moved like shadows through the forest, breaking into cabins, stealing supplies, leaving behind traces, bloody socks, candy wrappers, DNA on beer cans, until finally Richard Matt made a mistake. Cornered near a cabin just 30 miles from the Canadian border, he raised a shotgun at a border patrol agent. One bullet through the skull ended the manhunt for him, but David Sweat kept running, barefoot, bleeding, desperate. 2 days later, he was spotted. An officer fired twice. Sweat dropped. Alive. Captured.
One of the escaped convicts is dead, the other is alive and reportedly opening up to authorities. How did these killers hide for so long? And is there trouble ahead for prison officials?
He's back in prison now. Maximum security. Life without parole. But what haunts most isn't how they escaped. It's how close they came to killing again. Because sometimes a prison doesn't fail with a bang. It fails with a whisper, with a smuggled blade, a forged friendship, a quiet plan in the dark. And while Matt and Sweat needed tools and tunnels, the next man needed only a smile, a wooden gun, and a getaway car waiting outside. John Dillinger wasn't just an escapee. He was public enemy number 1, and for a time, he was unstoppable. John Dillinger, public enemy, escaped. In the middle of the Great Depression, when America was starving, broken and desperate, John Dillinger became something else entirely, a legend. He didn't just rob banks, he humiliated them. He didn't just escape prison, he made it look easy. Dillinger was no ordinary crook. He was a showman with a .45 and a grin. Newspapers printed his every move. Crowds followed his trials. Women wrote him letters. To the public, he was a modern-day Robin Hood with better suits and faster cars. But the reality was colder. Dead guards, wounded bystanders, entire towns held hostage at gunpoint. He didn't steal for justice. He stole for the thrill. In 1933, he was arrested and thrown into what was considered an escape-proof facility, Lake County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana. The guards posed for photos with him, joked with him, admired the swagger. Then one morning he walked out. Legend says the gun he used was carved from wood and blackened with shoe polish. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter, because it worked. He locked up the guards, took 2 hostages, stole the sheriff's car, and drove straight through the front gate like it was nothing. A middle finger to the system, rubber on the pavement. That escape embarrassed the entire state. It also gave him time, just enough time to kill again. Dillinger returned to what he knew best: robbery, violence, firefights with police. But now the stakes were higher. The FBI labeled him public enemy number 1. The country wanted blood. And Dillinger? He wanted chaos. In April 1934, he and his gang robbed a police station in South Dakota, then a bank in Iowa. In the crossfire, a patrolman was shot and killed. Another escape. Another dead cop. This wasn't just crime. It was a war. But every legend has an end. And Dillinger's came outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago. After watching a Clark Gable movie, he walked into the summer night with 2 women, one of them an FBI informant. When agents closed in, he ran, reached for his gun. They shot him in the back, 3 times. He collapsed in an alley, bled out on the sidewalk, dead before he hit the ground. Crowds gathered around his body, touched his blood, took souvenirs, because even in death, John Dillinger was a spectacle. But what he left behind was more than a body count. It was a message to every prison, every guard, every lock and key. If the man is determined, no wall is high enough. And while Dillinger made escape into theater, the next man turned it into a game of cat and mouse, one that stretched from California to Mexico, across borders and through years, with bodies left behind. Because Glenn Stewart Godwin didn't just escape once, he escaped twice, and each time, someone died. Glenn Stewart Godwin, the 2-time escapist. Most escapees vanish into the shadows, change their name, blend into the crowd, disappear. But Glenn Stewart Godwin wasn't interested in hiding. He wasn't trying to vanish. He was biding time, until he could kill again. In 1980, Godwin was a military-trained mechanic with a violent streak. When a drug deal turned sour, he and an accomplice tortured a man named Kim LaValle. They beat him, stabbed him, stuffed his body into a stolen truck, and blew it up in the California desert. The crime was cruel, calculated, and loud. Godwin was sentenced to 26 years to life in Folsom Prison, one of the toughest in the country. Razor wire, guard towers, inmates who had nothing left to lose. But Godwin had a plan. In 1987, using homemade tools, a smuggled hacksaw, and insider help, he carved through cell bars, crawled through a storm drain, and emerged outside the walls. The escape was intricate, coordinated, and clean. By the time guards noticed he was gone, Godwin was already in Mexico. He should have disappeared, changed names, started over. Instead, he killed again. In Mexico, Godwin was arrested on drug trafficking charges and thrown into Puente Grande, one of the country's most notorious prisons. But prison hadn't changed him. It had refined him. Sometime in 1991, he murdered another inmate inside the facility. The motive? Unclear. The method? Brutal. And before authorities could finish processing the crime, he vanished again, slipping out of a Mexican prison with the same cold precision he'd shown in California. 2 prisons, 2 escapes, 2 bodies, and then nothing. Godwin became a ghost. No confirmed sightings, no fingerprints, no trail. The FBI added him to the 10 most wanted list, warning that he was a master of deception and highly dangerous. But even now, decades later, he remains a mystery. Some say he's dead. Others believe he's still alive, living under an alias, hiding in plain sight, waiting for anyone foolish enough to trust him. Because Glenn Stewart Godwin wasn't driven by desperation. He was driven by control, by method, by the thrill of knowing the system couldn't hold him. And while Godwin's path was defined by cold calculation, the next killer escaped with rage in his blood, and the moment he touched freedom, he hunted again. Rodney Halbauer didn't disappear into the dark. He went straight back to killing, and this time he left a trail soaked in innocence. Rodney Halbauer, the return of a predator. He was already a rapist, a violent offender, a man with a long, grim record, but what no one knew, what no one could prove, was that Rodney Halbauer had already killed. He just hadn't been caught for it yet. That would come later. In 1986, Halbauer was serving time in Nevada for sexual assault. It wasn't his first conviction. He had bounced between prisons for years, crimes against women, armed robbery, attempted murder. The file was thick, but Nevada held him, until it didn't. He was transferred to a low-security facility for medical treatment. That's where he broke out. Overpowered guards, stole a car, vanished into the wind. And that's when the bloodshed began again. 2 months after his escape, a 17-year-old girl named Michelle Mitchell was found murdered in Reno. Her body was discovered in a garage, throat slashed, wrists bound. Police arrested a woman named Kathy Woods wrongly. She confessed under pressure. She was convicted. But the real killer, he was on the run. Halbauer drifted across state lines, quiet, restless, unstoppable. He didn't stay still. He didn't stop hurting people. And eventually he was caught again. Not for murder, but for another assault, back behind bars. But again, the system saw only pieces of the puzzle. A violent man, yes, but a killer. That part was still hidden until DNA spoke. Decades later, long after Halbauer thought his past was buried, investigators re-examined evidence from a string of unsolved murders known as the Gypsy Hill Killings, a series of young women slaughtered in California in 1976. The results were chilling. Rodney Halbauer's DNA was there, on multiple victims. Suddenly his timeline wasn't just stained, it was soaked. He had escaped in 1986, but the truth was far worse. He had already been killing 10 years earlier. His freedom wasn't the start of a spree, it was a continuation. A predator allowed to keep hunting. Rodney Halbauer was finally convicted in 2018 for 2 of the Gypsy Hill murders. He's likely connected to more. The full count remains unknown. What is known is this: the moment he escaped, people started dying again. Because some men don't run toward freedom, they run toward opportunity. And if Halbauer slashed in secret, the next man killed with headlines on his heels. His face was on the news, his name was known, but none of that stopped him from slipping away and leaving a corpse behind. Stephen Robbins didn't just escape. He walked out the front door. Stephen Robbins, the paperwork error that killed. He wasn't supposed to be free. He wasn't supposed to leave the building. He wasn't supposed to breathe fresh air again. But someone made a mistake. Stephen Robbins had been serving a life sentence in Michigan. Murder. Cold, deliberate execution style. His victim was a man involved in a dispute over drugs, one that Robbins decided to end with a bullet. No parole, no release date, just steel bars and time. But in 2013, Robbins was transported to Indiana. The reason? A decades-old charge, an administrative technicality, something that should have been routine: transfer, hearing, return. Instead, he walked out. The mistake was simple: a paperwork error. Officials processed his release as if the Indiana case was his only offense. No mention of the life sentence, no red flags, no last-minute double-check. So they handed him his clothes, his freedom. and he disappeared. For 2 days, no one noticed. By the time Michigan authorities realized what had happened, Robbins was already back in the shadows, angry, unstable, and armed. It didn't take long. Somewhere between his release and his recapture, another man ended up dead. The details weren't clear. The body count was murky, but investigators were confident Robbins hadn't just escaped. He'd returned to form. When police finally tracked him down, he didn't resist. As if he knew it was over. As if it had all been inevitable. He was flown back to Michigan and buried deep within the system again. This time, no chances. But the damage was done. Not because Robbins had outwitted the system. Because the system had forgotten who he was. One clerical error, one missed line, one dead man. And while Robbins killed in the confusion, the next escapee used chaos as camouflage. Because Brian Nichols didn't slip away quietly, he exploded out of a courthouse and left bodies in every room he passed. Brian Nichols, escape in a storm of gunfire. Some escapes are planned for years, blueprints, bribes, tunnels, maps. Brian Nichols didn't need any of that. All he needed was a moment. March 11th, 2005, Atlanta, Georgia. Nichols was facing trial for rape, a high-profile case in a courthouse filled with armed deputies, reporters, and the tension of justice about to unfold. He wasn't cuffed, he wasn't shackled, one hand free, one plan forming in silence. He waited, he watched, and when the female deputy guarding him turned her back, he struck. A single punch to the head knocked her unconscious. He took her gun, then her radio, then her keys, and then he started walking. Through the hallways of the Fulton County Courthouse, Brian Nichols became a one-man massacre. He entered the courtroom where his trial was about to begin and opened fire. He shot the presiding judge. He shot the court reporter. He shot a sheriff's deputy trying to intervene. 3 people, dead in seconds. But he wasn't done. He fled the courthouse, hijacked a car, and shot a federal agent outside. 4 victims. In less than an hour, Atlanta went into full lockdown. Helicopters hovered. SWAT mobilized. News anchors spoke with a tremble in their voices. Nichols was loose, armed, trained, and fueled by rage. And then he vanished. For nearly 24 hours, the city held its breath. Where had he gone? How had he disappeared into a place so crowded, so watched? The answer came in the form of a quiet knock on the door. Ashley Smith was a single mother, recovering from addiction. She had just stepped out to grab cigarettes when she returned home, and found a stranger inside. Brian Nichols, gun drawn, drenched in sweat, eyes wide. He tied her up, held her hostage, but instead of panic came a strange calm. They talked, for hours. She read him passages from The Purpose-Driven Life, spoke to him about forgiveness, faith, regret. He listened, he asked questions, ate pancakes, let her go. And by morning, he surrendered. No more shots, no final standoff. Just the man who had turned a courthouse into a war zone, giving himself up. Brian Nichols was convicted of multiple murders, sentenced to life in prison without parole. But what made his escape unforgettable wasn't just the body count. It was the speed, the savagery, and the surreal calm that followed. He didn't climb walls or sneak through ducts. He erupted like a grenade in a courthouse. Because sometimes escape isn't a slow, calculated plan. Sometimes it's a detonation. And if Nichols turned a courtroom into a killing field, the next man used his escape to vanish between states, again and again, leaving behind lies, aliases, and bodies. Donald Gene Evans wasn't a ghost. He was a drifter, and wherever he stopped moving, someone died. Donald Gene Evans, the drifter who wouldn't stay locked down. There was nothing remarkable about him at first glance. A thin man, wiry, quiet, the kind of face that disappears in a crowd. But Donald Gene Evans didn't want to be noticed. He wanted to move, from state to state, motel to motel, crime scene to crime scene, and every time someone tried to stop him, he slipped through their fingers. Evans was first arrested in 1986 for the brutal rape and murder of a 10-year-old girl in Mississippi. Her name was Beatrice Ruth. She had been jogging in a public park when Evans abducted her, assaulted her, and then strangled her to death. The act was horrific, the motive, pure predation. He was convicted and sentenced to death, locked away, case closed. But in 1991, during a routine prison transfer in Florida, Evans did what he did best. He vanished. He overpowered a guard during a bathroom stop, escaped into the night, and triggered a manhunt that stretched across the South. For 4 months he drifted. No known address, no fixed routine, just a burner trail of false names and stolen identities. It wasn't until he was caught in Houston, arrested after police responded to a disturbance, that they realized who he really was. But the arrest didn't stop the horror. It only opened the door to more. Once back in custody, Evans started talking, bragging. He claimed responsibility for over 70 murders. Investigators didn't believe him at first. Then they started checking. And piece by piece, his stories began to align with cold cases across the country. Texas, Florida, Mississippi, possibly even California. Evans wasn't just a killer. He was a collector. He kept track of dates, names, methods. He wrote it all down. A ledger of death scribbled on prison paper. He had no remorse, no excuse. Just one repeated phrase. I enjoyed it. But before the full extent of his crimes could be unraveled, prison caught up with him. In 1999, another inmate stabbed Evans to death in the prison shower. No warning, no motive, just silence and blood on the tiles. And maybe that's the only way his story could end. Not with justice, not with redemption, but with violence and a closed file. Because Donald Gene Evans wasn't haunted by his crimes. He was comfortable with them. And while his escape led to more horror, the next fugitive never even made it to death row. Because Lester Eubanks was sentenced to die. And then he went shopping. Lester Eubanks, the man who walked away. Some prison breaks are violent, explosive. Smoke and sirens and gunfire in the yard. Lester Eubanks didn't need any of that. He just needed a shopping trip. In 1966, Eubanks was convicted of a crime so brutal it shook Ohio to its core. He had stalked 14-year-old Mary Ellen Dina, cornered her behind a laundromat, and shot her when she screamed. Then, when the gun jammed, he bludgeoned her to death with a brick. He was arrested quickly, tried, convicted, sentenced to death. But then the law changed. The U.S. Supreme Court suspended the death penalty in 1972, and Eubanks' sentence was commuted to life in prison. Still, there was no chance of parole. No way out, until the guards handed him the keys. In December 1973, as part of a so-called honor program, Eubanks was allowed to leave the Ohio prison grounds unsupervised to go Christmas shopping, a reward for good behavior, a test of trust. He passed through the gates, strolled into a department store, and never came back. It sounds impossible, ridiculous, but it happened. No alarms, no manhunt, not for hours. By the time anyone realized he wasn't coming back, Lester Eubanks had vanished into the folds of America, and he stayed vanished. For decades, he changed identities, moved through states, worked odd jobs, lived under the radar. At one point, he may have worked as a janitor, at another a mechanic. Every few years, a new lead would surface, then fade. In 2018, the U.S. Marshals put him on their 15 most wanted list. A $50,000 reward, national coverage. Tips poured in, but none of them stuck. As of now, Lester Eubanks remains at large, an admitted child killer, a convicted murderer, and a man who walked out of prison because someone let him. There's no known kill count beyond Mary Ellen Dina, but when a man like that disappears into the world, the question isn't if he killed again, it's how many times. And while Eubanks slipped away in silence, the next man broke out with help from the inside. Because William Kendall wasn't alone when he escaped. He had a guard's uniform, a stolen identity, and revenge on his mind. William Kendall, the imposter who walked out. Some escapes are loud, fueled by gunfire, blood, and burning rubber. But William Kendall didn't need a weapon. He only needed one thing: to be forgotten. Convicted in Texas for cold-blooded murder, Kendall was the kind of inmate that prison guards didn't chat with. He wasn't volatile. He wasn't loud. He was quiet, watchful. A man whose eyes didn't blink enough. The kind of prisoner who made others nervous not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. His crime had been simple, personal, lethal. A man was ambushed and shot in the chest, left to die. Kendall was caught quickly. The trial was short, the sentence life. But while other inmates paced in their cells or started fights in the yard, Kendall studied, watched, waited. And one day, opportunity arrived, not with a crowbar or a riot, but with a release date. Another inmate, same unit, same general appearance, was scheduled to be discharged. He had served his time, a minor conviction, minimal attention. Somehow, no one's quite sure how, Kendall got access to that man's ID. Not just the number, but the full identity. It may have involved bribery, forged documents, inside help. What's certain is this: he shaved, changed his posture, rehearsed a new signature. And on that morning in 2002, William Kendall became someone else. He walked out of W.F. Ramsey unit wearing civilian clothes, holding paperwork that said he was a free man. Guards signed off on the forms. Doors opened. No questions asked. Kendall didn't run. He didn't even walk quickly. He moved like a man who had just served his time. He disappeared into the Houston streets like smoke in a breeze. For 2 years, silence. No phone calls, no sightings, no slips. Until a murder in Oklahoma brought his name back into the light. A man never officially named was found dumped in a rural drainage ditch. Shot, strangled, disposed of like garbage. The scene bore no signature, but Kendall's fingerprints were found on a surface nearby. It wasn't just a clue. It was a shadow stretching back toward Texas. The trail eventually led to Kendall, living under an alias in another state, blending into a small town, working odd jobs. When he was pulled over, he didn't resist, didn't panic. He offered a false name, smiled politely, like it was all part of the act. Back in custody, Kendall refused to speak about the murder. No confession, no motive, just that same cold quiet that had followed him through every cell block he ever walked. He's back in prison now, where the bars are heavier, the doors louder, and the trust long gone. But his escape left a scar, because it didn't happen in the shadows. It happened in daylight. And it worked because the system trusted a piece of paper more than it feared a man with a murderer's calm. And while Kendall's freedom lasted only 2 years, the next man walked away and stayed gone for almost 4 decades. Because James Robert Jones didn't just slip through the cracks, he built a life on the other side. Rafael Resendez Ramirez, the railway killer who came back. He moved like a ghost, never left fingerprints, never stayed long. His footsteps faded into steel rails and gravel, and by the time anyone realized what had happened, there was only blood, coagulating in a quiet house beside the tracks. Rafael Resendez Ramirez wasn't just an escapee. He was a phantom with a timetable. A killer who rode freight trains across the American South like some drifting executioner, choosing victims not by name, but by proximity to the rails. His crimes were savage: blunt force trauma, rocks, sledgehammers, wooden clubs, tools found nearby, ordinary objects turned into instruments of slaughter. He didn't shoot. He didn't stab. He bludgeoned, faces crushed, skulls shattered. Sometimes the victims were sleeping, other times praying. And always, just before dawn, they were dead. He murdered at least 9 people across Texas, Kentucky, and Illinois. Maybe more. Whole families were wiped out in their homes, door locks untouched, windows unbroken. Because Resendez didn't need to break in. He just waited until the train slowed and stepped off into their lives. When the FBI closed in, he vanished, disappeared across the border into Mexico like vapor slipping through cracks. He was placed on the 10 most wanted list, flyers printed in English and Spanish. Officers warned the public, do not approach, do not engage, just run. But then, something even more bizarre happened. He turned himself in. In July 1999, after pressure from his family and whispers of mounting guilt, Resendez walked across a bridge into El Paso and surrendered to authorities. Calm, silent, no resistance, like it had all been preordained. He was convicted in 2000 and sentenced to death. Justice finally seemed served. But what most people don't know, what was buried beneath the headlines, is that Resendez had already escaped once before. Years earlier, in 1997, he had been arrested in New Mexico on a minor trespassing charge. His real identity was unknown at the time, and without a system in place to flag him as a suspect in any murders, he was released. And as soon as he walked free, he started killing again. That administrative misstep, a failure to link fingerprints, names, or aliases, left a window open, and through it the railway killer slipped and painted his path in red. He was executed in 2006 by lethal injection, and as the chemicals entered his veins, he made no final statement. But the silence was not peace. It was a reminder. A man who moved with timetables, who chose homes at random, who made proximity to train tracks a death sentence, should never have walked free. Because Resende didn't just escape the system. He exploited it, and every mile of track he traveled became a corridor of death. But if Resende hunted with quiet rage, the next man brought the scream back into the story. Because when Jerry McFadden broke out of jail, he didn't hide in shadows. He kidnapped, he killed, and he made sure the entire state of Texas knew his name again. Jerry McFadden, the beast who couldn't be caged. They called him the Animal. Not because he growled, not because he howled, but because every time Jerry McFadden was put in a cage, he found a way out, and every time he got out, someone died. His history was already soaked in blood long before the escape that made him infamous. McFadden had a record that read like a list of warnings no one had taken seriously: multiple sexual assaults, attempted kidnappings, violent offenses spanning more than a decade. Each time he was arrested, there was talk of how dangerous he was. Each time he was convicted, there was doubt about how long he'd stay behind bars. And in 1986, that doubt turned deadly. He was already serving a sentence when he was connected to the abduction, rape, and murder of 18-year-old Gina Turner, a cheerleader from Hawkins, Texas. She was found in the woods, naked and strangled, her body dumped like an afterthought. 2 male friends she had been with were also abducted, bound, gagged, and left for dead. They survived. She didn't. McFadden was convicted and sent to jail while awaiting his formal transfer to death row. And that's where he made his move. On May 1st, 1986, while being held in the Upshur County Jail, McFadden overpowered a jailer, took his gun, took his keys, then took another inmate hostage and escaped into the thick East Texas pine woods, disappearing into a region where the trees swallow sound and the sun rarely hits the forest floor. What followed wasn't just a manhunt, it was a siege. Helicopters sliced the sky, dogs howled through the timberland, armed citizens manned roadblocks, schools shut down, local businesses closed early. Everyone knew who McFadden was, and what he'd do if he found a girl walking alone, a door left unlocked, a path through the trees. He was hunted like a wolf, but he was faster, smarter, more desperate. For 3 days he ran. Then finally, cornered in a field, he was caught. Dirty, bleeding, armed, still fighting. But this time there would be no court delay, no appeals. He was sentenced to death. And in 1999, after years of waiting, Jerry McFadden was strapped to a gurney in Huntsville, Texas. He looked at the ceiling, took a final breath, and became silent, but his legacy remained. Because Jerry McFadden didn't just escape from jail, he escaped through cracks in a system that kept offering him another chance. Chance to reform, chance to vanish, chance to kill again. And while McFadden needed violence to escape, the next man slipped away without blood, because Edward Randy Chisholm didn't force his way out. He simply walked off the job. Edward Randy Chisholm, the predator who vanished in plain sight. He wore a uniform, clocked in on time, smiled at co-workers. And every day Edward Randy Chisholm walked freely in and out of the prison gates, not as an inmate but as a trusted worker on a special crew outside the wire. What no one realized was that they had given a monster the keys. In 2003, Chisholm was serving a life sentence in Texas for the repeated sexual abuse of a child. The details of his crimes were nauseating, buried in court transcripts too painful to revisit. The jury didn't hesitate. The sentence was clear. There was no parole, no debate. And yet, for reasons still questioned years later, Chisholm was placed in a special trust program. A work crew, minimum supervision, open space, lighter restrictions. He was assigned to maintain the grounds outside of the Clemens unit, a job meant for model inmates nearing the end of their time. But Edward Randy Chisholm wasn't nearing the end. He was just getting started. On October 8, 2003, under the hot Texas sun, Chisholm walked away. No sirens, no struggle, no alarm. He simply stepped off the job site, disappeared into a patch of trees, and kept walking. By the time anyone noticed, he was gone. He shaved his beard, changed clothes, hitched rides across county lines. In days, he made it out of the state. In weeks, he was blending in. In months, he was gone. But Chisholm didn't run to escape punishment. He ran because he had unfinished business. Some fugitives lie low, hide in trailers, sleep under fake names. Chisholm moved through cities, staying just long enough to feel confident again, long enough to pray again. Within a year, he was wanted for more than escape, more accusations, more victims, Another child harmed, another family shattered. The details were sealed, not for secrecy, but for protection, because the crimes mirrored the past. And that was the pattern. Edward Chisholm didn't escape. He reactivated. He was finally captured in Louisiana after a tip from a stranger, someone who saw a face that didn't sit right, whose instinct screamed when the smile seemed forced. But the damage had already been done. Chisholm is now buried deep in the Texas prison system, maximum security, no more outside jobs. But his escape wasn't physical. It was institutional. A man sentenced for child rape, placed in a program that gave him a view of the highway. And when that gate cracked open, he stepped through, because sometimes a killer doesn't break out. He's let out, and if Chisholm walked out with ease, the next man dug his way out with desperation and ended his run not in a court, but in a shootout. Because the final escapee didn't care if he got away. He just wanted to take someone with him. Some escapes are about freedom. These weren't. These men didn't run to start over. They ran to finish what they'd begun. To hunt again. To kill again. They didn't slip through cracks. They were let out, walked out, smiled their way through the front door. And every time someone died. Because a cage doesn't cure what's inside. It only delays it. And when the locks fail, the monster doesn't disappear. He returns,